Here's the agenda for today. So as I mentioned, we're going to do some small group discussion to debrief the presentation by Mark. We also have decided for today's session that at 2 o'clock, we'll close the formal presentation, but stay on the line for an additional 30 minutes with Mark. So if you're interested in basically having an open space discussion, you're welcome to stay on for the additional 30 minutes. On the next slide. Before we start the presentation, I'll just briefly mention some of what we heard from you around Module 2, Shifting Awareness and Culture, and our check-ins with you. For the most part, it sounds like it resonated across the board. Module 2 spurred some new thinking for some of you around awareness, will, and action tactics. Some of you are bringing this discussion back to steering committees or roundtables to also inspire discussion around what new or different future actions might look like. Staff capacity is still coming up in several conversations as a primary concern or challenge, and there's some interesting ways that some of you are working around that, particularly working around with partners. There's a sort of been a mixed reaction to some of the language that we're using. It looks like some of you appreciate the flexibility of our offering of really broad definitions of certain items, and whereas some of you are looking for more definition or clarity. So if you're one of those people who are looking for more, maybe stay on for the additional 30 minutes if you can. It was nice also, we heard, to have a list of potential indicators, but it's important to note that it's not an exhaustive list. It's just meant to be a sort of a sampling of what you can do or measure. And so it's not the be all and end all. There are opportunities to add your own. It looks like we also heard you want more time with Mark. So I'm gonna not spend too much time on this. We want to spend our time with you, Mark. And we're gonna make sure today in the breakouts that we're including a staff member or a volunteer lead person to help facilitate the conversations, because that was feedback that we heard from last time as well. So with that, Mark, we can go to the next slide. Just as a reminder, this is where we are at in terms of the series itself. We're at the midway point, module 3 of 6. So congratulations, you made it halfway. And with that, Mark, I'll hand it over to you to start the presentation.
Thanks, Kirsty, and thanks everyone for joining. Just a quick note, Kirsty, if I should go offline again, maybe you could put in the slide deck that you have rather than the one I control, just in case I'm off for a little bit and you need to hold off. You need to hold on for another minute for me to get back on.
Yeah, will do, Mark.
Okay, great. So everyone, here's our big question for this series. This is our third time we're looking at it, if not more. How might we measure our local impact in reducing poverty in our community so we can communicate our progress to our stakeholders? And what we're doing is acknowledging that there's multiple reasons that you would evaluate or try to measure impact. We're dealing with the very basic one, simply tracking and communicating progress, which is foundational to the other two types of learning, which is strategic uses of measurement. One is strategic learning, use measurements to inform progress so we can improve our work, and strategic choices, making big decisions about whether to adapt, shut down, or scale up our initiative. These are also important pieces of work to be done, but we've just said these are out of scope for our session. We're going to focus first on these foundational, trying to get an understanding of what it is we're doing. What's important to know, because later on you will want to be talking about strategic learning and strategic choices, and that has some additional elaboration that we decided not to pursue in this series, but we're happy to talk about in the half-hour section after. The framework we're using, and several of you asked about this framework before, just so a refresher about why we're using it. We are making some language distinctions here, where we are saying impact is reductions in poverty for people, either people at a programmatic level in a certain neighborhood or an entire city or region, and that's the right-hand side of this diagram. We will be tackling that in session 5. But outcomes, for the purpose of this series, refers to 3 types of outcomes: programmatic initiatives, systems and policy change outcomes, and improving community awareness and buy-in and will to act. And so that is what we're talking about in terms of outcomes. And some of you earlier said these were outputs or inputs. They kind of are, I guess, in terms of impact, but what we're saying is you don't get impact unless we get these intermediate outcomes. So right now we're dealing with the second of this series, which is systems, and our second in the series of outcomes, which is systems and policy change outcomes. That's what we're concerned about today. And we could talk about systems and policy change across the board in terms of things that help reduce poverty, or they could be in specific areas of your plan priorities. Example, early learning and care systems, workforce development systems, education systems, housing systems. So that's what we want to focus on today. How do we know we're making progress in those areas? So let's just remind ourselves of a quote we used earlier on. Programmatic interventions help beat the odds of poverty by changing systems that keep poverty in place, and reproduce poverty can change people's odds. This is why when people say, hey, just show me tangibly what you've done, we often refer to programs and initiatives, but we also have to zoom out and talk a little bit about the systems in which they're embedded. So let's spend a couple minutes just watching a video. And I think I have to reboot this to make sure it's good. Share computer sound. And I'm going to go in. Kirsty, get ready to jump on if you don't hear the sound here. But let's give it a shot.
Systems thinking, a way to maximize program effectiveness. Systems thinking. Maybe you've heard of it, are doing it, or you've heard that you should be doing it. What is it, and what does it mean for the senior manager? Let's start by looking at what a system is. A system is any kind of entity that is made up of parts that interact. Together, these parts and their interconnections create a whole, which in turn produces some kind of result. Using a systems perspective is important because it helps us to better understand what helps or hinders the success of health interventions. Here's an example. Meet Suzanne. Suzanne is a senior manager in a large regional health organization. The high rate of obesity is an issue in her community, and she's been mandated to address this problem. Her first instinct is to develop a program to get more people active. But what is realistic to expect from this approach? Systems thinkers believe that viewing a program like this, apart, in isolation of the larger system within which it operates, the whole, tends to ignore other aspects that might influence its potential for impact. Why? Research tells us that obesity is the result of a combination of many physiological, psychological, social, environmental, and economic factors that all interact with one another. For example, at the individual level, there are issues such as human physiology, exercise habits, food choices, and one's occupation. But beyond the individual, there are other factors at play, such as the local built environment, quick and easy access to junk food, and larger food industry practices, such as trends in portion sizes, sugar, and fat content. The interaction of all these influences make obesity the product of what we call a complex system. If Suzanne were to use a systems approach, she would realize that relying on simple linear cause and effect solutions for one program would ignore those interactions and likely fail. While Suzanne's staff at the program level have a tendency to think only within the boundaries of their program, senior managers and planners like Suzanne are in a unique position to do what systems thinkers call zooming out. Zooming out considers how other aspects outside of a program's traditional boundaries, both within the organization and beyond, might influence the success of the program. By zooming out and looking at the influence of other interventions, policies, structures, patterns, and norms in the broader system, Suzanne is better able to strategically consider other values and perspectives and the interrelationships among each that may impact obesity rates in her community. In doing so, she can identify more powerful leverage points outside of the program that have the potential to facilitate and support changes in obesity. Leverage points are places within the system that can be tweaked in a way that supports greater impact. For example, are there actions Suzanne and her team might take that could increase the community's access to opportunities for physical activity? While some leverage points are within Suzanne's capacity to change, others will be beyond her control. However, it will still be useful to be aware of these as she plans for the program. Adopting a systems view won't change the boundaries of this program, but it will expand the boundaries of the evaluation. By recognizing the importance of the different perspectives and values of those outside the program and the interrelationships throughout the system, Suzanne can ensure that the evaluation is framed in a way that captures the key boundaries, diverse perspectives, and interrelationships that serve as important leverage points in the system. Of course, Suzanne's budget won't permit an evaluation of the entire system, but she can ensure that any evaluation she commissions will provide her with more strategic direction on how to effectively address obesity within her community. For example, in addition to recommendations for improving the program, the results of the evaluation might indicate opportunities for new partnerships or external policy change. If her community has poor walking and cycling infrastructure, where might she and her team advocate? Or who could they collaborate with to make changes? By asking these questions, Suzanne is finding that using a systems approach helps her focus on the broader issue of obesity in her community instead of a single program in her organization. She gains a better understanding of what external factors are influencing the program's success and can set more reasonable expectations of what it can accomplish. She's also learning what needs to change both within and outside of the program to better maximize her organization's effectiveness. Many now believe that a systems approach holds the most promise for addressing complex health problems like obesity, which is not only good for Suzanne, but good for everyone.
So I hope that everyone was able to hear that all right. And what I liked about that video is it's a nice introduction to this very simple concept of zooming in and zooming in on programs and zooming out on systems. However, the takeaway from this program is that we are also in the game of not just zooming out to acknowledge the context in which we work for programs, but to actually change the context in which we work, to change the systems that not only affect programs, but directly affect the lives of people we're trying to support. So in that video, they made some distinctions here. And as we go through this, everyone, I want you to let you know that systems thinking isn't always that straightforward to do. It can be a little bit, require a little bit of effort, and our mainstreaming of this stuff is relatively new. So we're in a field that is not yet fully accomplished. We're learning our way through this, but we are beginning to see some early patterns, including what they just mentioned is the basic description of a system. We have a system that has boundaries, geographic boundaries and domain boundaries. Some of you are working in the system of education at a regional level. You could be working on the boundary of housing at a provincial level. You could be working at community safety at a neighborhood level. So there are boundaries that are, oh, maybe we could put people on mute, Kirsty. There are boundaries that are domain and geographic. There's actors within those systems who are doing things, and they have relationships and things that drive their behavior. When you intervene into a system, we get outcomes, and the system, you'll see, adapts as well. So we are working in living systems. Imagine if you changed a policy around development costs in certain neighborhoods that required certain number of housing units to be affordable, whatever that meant in a certain community. You would intervene, you might get some outcomes there, but also the context for housing development changes. So every time you intervene into a system, the system itself changes a little bit. Now, when people really get into this, and some people really do, they start mapping their systems. And so on your left-hand side, we'll see a spaghetti diagram that shows the labor market system for young youth who are harder to employ and trying to get jobs. The Anna E. Casey Foundation eventually put this together, and they created a simplified version of that. And they said, when you look at a labor market, and in our desperate effort to find leverage points, drivers of behavior, we see that there are supply side factors in all those bubbles and arrows and demand side factors. And a simplified version of this, if you really want to have an influence on that labor market system, you could work on resources, power, authority, information signals, policies, and operational competencies, and all of those, in fact. In fact, one of the things that we found is that when you're trying to develop programs for those that are hard to employ, training institutions often don't know what jobs they're supposed to be training for, and businesses who want to hire people and complain about bad training often can't anticipate their job needs 6 months out. And so you might start developing relationships between people so they could develop customized training, better information signals back and forth, policies that required people to talk to each other when they were developing customized training, etc. One or more of these drivers, the argument is, would have a disproportionate influence on the system. Now, What do we mean by system outcomes? Well, you saw that diagram, the visual that we saw earlier with drivers and structures and relationships. I'll let you know there's multiple different ways of thinking about drivers for systems. And if you really want to be goofy about it, or geeky, I should say, Donella Meadows is the first person to think hard about this and to popularize it. And she has 12 leverage points for change, Donella Meadows. More recently, John Kanya, who many of you know from Collective Impact, and Mark Kramer and Peter Senge. Peter Senge is from the Fifth Discipline, many of you remember. They simplified that story into the 6 conditions of systems change in their paper called The Water of Systems Change. And they argue that there's different levels of change that you can have. Structural change, which is sort of on the surface, change policies, change practices or resource flows. Next level is change relationships and connections and power dynamics. And the most fundamental one is change mental models or narratives or belief systems. Hold on to this because I think it's a nice simplification, but don't get worried if you see other ways of trying to make sense of systems, because there's lots of ways of understanding them. But the key idea to keep in mind is whatever your system is, what are the leverage points or the drivers that you want to change? And why do you want to change? How is that meant to directly or indirectly make the lives of people who are struggling with poverty better, or even to prevent their getting into poverty? So 2 more slides on this, everyone. Here's another way of thinking about this, and these are all system thinking ideas. When we talk about what outcomes are, here's one slide. When we're into the game of systems change, what we're trying to do is change the drivers or the leverage points in a system. Let's just take policy for an instance, and which is one factor in systems change. That's why I like calling it systems and policy change, not policy and systems change. If we change a policy, what we're hoping happens is that we change the behaviors of people in the system. So if you were to change a policy, for example, in Alberta right now, they're mucking around with the minimum wage that went up to $15, and they've just adjusted it so that certain sectors or certain ages of people are not held by that policy. So employers, if you're, I think I have this right, if you're under 18, you don't actually have to pay a minimum wage as another wage. That's a policy. Now the question is, if you introduce that policy, to what degree does it change behaviors of people in the system? And does it change the overall behavior of the system? So let's take an example of that. What if you found out that policy really influenced behavior in the food and beverage sector, and it changed that patch of the system, but it didn't change the behavior across the whole retail sector? Well, you'd say we changed the driver, number 1. We changed the behaviors of some actors, number 2, but we didn't change the behavior of the overall system. Maybe we weren't looking for it, but it's more localized to the food and beverage industry. Here's one more diagram that may or may not help. For those of you who don't think it helps, you can zone out and don't worry about it. For those of you that want to dig a bit deeper, we have this on the Tamarack website, questions for evaluating systems change. And what it does is make distinction between different kinds of outcomes. And so the systems change outcomes you'll see. Did we change drivers of system behavior, a policy, resource flows, relationships, whatever? Did that change any behaviors? Many of us, again, have seen policies get introduced or even new resource investments, but no behavior change. And 3, did it change the overall system behavior? Later, we're going to be talking in Module 5 about mission level outcomes. Did it generate benefits for individuals, for targeted geographies or groups, or for citywide population measures? And we're not talking about it in this series, but when we intervene into a system, what are we learning about ourselves, how we think about systems, and how we operate in systems? So again, the big thing to remember here is that we're trying to change drivers of behaviors. We want to know if behaviors actually change of key system actors, and do we see overall system behaviors change, or is it local? Now, let's get into the questions part of this. I'm going to summarize it by saying, when we ask questions about systems change, we have some planning questions and we have some results questions. We're asking, what are the boundaries of the system we're trying to change? Who are the key actors, and what are the key relationships and dynamics or drivers or leverage points of the system? When we talk about systems changes, again, the 3 questions we just mentioned, drivers, behaviors, and overall system behavior. And later on, we're going to say, to what degree did that contribute to poverty impact? And that's Module 5. So, knowing that, we're going to now quickly go through some methods and indicators for doing that that are reorganized now to talk about level 1, 2, and 3 capacity. And we talked about this before, and it's not perfect. You've let us know that it's not perfect, but it seems to be directionally correct that there are different levels of capacity in your group, and that should have some kind of influence on what kind of methods you choose. And so level 1 methods, we're going to talk a little bit about an outcome diary. Level 2, we're going to talk about outcome harvesting and most significant instances of policy and systems change. And level 3 will give an example of using multiple methods if you have the opportunity to do that. As you see these, I'm going to remind you of principle number 8. You could say, I love that method, let's adopt it. You might say, I like that method, but it's not perfect, so I have to adapt it. Or you might say, I get the general idea, I don't like any of those methods, but I have the time, willingness, and the expertise to develop my own. You have those choices in front of you. Let's take this illustrative example again of payday lending reform in Alberta. Everyone remember that from one of our earlier chats. Payday lending was a great example of Vibrant Communities Calgary with the leadership of Momentum and the United Way and others, part of a financial empowerment collaborative, who decided to address payday lending as a policy change at multiple levels, the provincial level, the local level, and including behavior change of private sector lenders who they were asking to fill the gap that might be left by payday lending. Now, when this happened, here's a level 1 method. This is called outcome diaries, and it was actually developed spontaneously by Liz Weaver, who many of you know at Tamarack. But when I met Liz, when I was the director of Vibrant Communities Canada, she was the head of the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. And she developed, in part in response to Tamarack's evaluation framework, an outcome diary that she would lay up she would fill out every Friday for 10 or 15 minutes. Liz is very disciplined and organized, and she would sit down and she would say, what happened this week? Did we have any kind of initiative that had an impact on individuals or households? Did we have anything around how we work differently around community capacity? And finally, she would say, what kind of policy and systems change did we see this week? She would name the partner or the partners, describe what had happened, what was the outcome, i.e. changed a policy or got it on the policy agenda. And she would talk about the Hamilton Roundtable Poverty Reduction's involvement. What did they do to contribute to that? Now that's very interesting because this was done every week, and some of you might say, hey, it's easy to start having bias and missing things here, and of course that's true. But at a minimum, it creates a pattern of documentation that one can refer to and start communicating out to the community. So outcome diaries, in many ways, I would argue, is something that in this version or another, we should all be doing. Whether we can do it weekly like Liz, that's another question, but this is level 1 basic monitoring for everyone. You could change this, I would suggest changing it, but tracking weekly is important because we will forget things. So here's a hypothetical instance of what Liz might have done in the Calgary situation. She would have said November 15th, 2015, by the way, these are all made up dates and stuff. I don't know any, no, actually these dates are correct, but here's how I would have written it down. She would say the city reviews how the bylaws can reduce the impact of predatory lending. The outcome was actually the city's changed land use bylaw in the following ways. It happened in November. Why is that important? Here's the suggested impact. And what did the roundtable contribute? And this is a hypothetical thing that they said they organized and submitted research input into policy discussions. You can see all the way down here that this could be simply a weekly thing. And you'll notice here that Liz is putting something in November 2015. Theoretically, she doesn't have anything to say until June 2016, and then it's May 2016. So very simple, basic monitoring level 1 method. In your diagram, in your workbook, you have an outcome diary, and if you're really wanting to geek out, there's something called outcome mapping, which is far more sophisticated, but also has a version of outcome diaries as well. That's in your book. Let's go to level 2, and we talked about outcome harvesting, and we've chatted about outcome harvesting before. This is actually where you have to do a little bit more than documentation. You do the documentation, but there's processes for gathering further descriptions to your documentation about what you think happened and your contribution from multiple different sources. So it's a very good method when we are looking at systems change. We have a lot of stakeholders, and a lot of your stuff emerges rather than is fully planned. And anyone involved in systems change work knows that you may have an intent and a hunch, but you're always adapting. So this is really good for that. And a big thing is sometimes results are very small and they accumulate over time. It's not just this little systems change, it's multiple system changes that come together to create tipping points and big moments. By the way, when we look at this, some of you might be skeptical, but this is actually used now by the World Bank, the Ford Foundation, and the United States Agency for International Development. So here's some definitions used if you want to take this to level 2. And what it says is when you're thinking about an outcome, you should be able to create things called outcome statements, where the outcomes are actions or behavior changed by key system actors. We're doing pilot projects that we never thought we would do. We're changing policies. We're making new investments. We're changing how we make decisions that align or contribute to the outcome that you want to see, i.e. reduce poverty. Impact is actually the effects of that policy change to the extent that we can understand them to reducing poverty. Significance is when you see a policy change, it asks us to say, why is that significant? And it asks for the opinion of people who are looking at it. And it could be multiple perspectives on what is significant. And finally, we've talked about it a number of times. It says, well, how did we contribute? And to what extent did we contribute to that policy? So let's take a quick look at this. This is from a hypothetical case study of the Tower Renewal Project in Toronto, where there is a big intent by some stakeholders to try and figure out how to upgrade the thousands of towers in Toronto, or at least 1,000 that were built between 1950 and 1970 and are now really bad on energy use, are decoupled from transportation systems and aren't really related to other community services and quality of life indicators, sort of isolated. So the big push is how do we get inventive around renewing these towers? So there's a lot of interventions behind that, but here's a little sample outcome vignette from that. In 2016, the Toronto City Housing Corporation and Toronto Atmospheres Fund launched a joint project to invest $4.2 million to retrofit 7 towers. That's an outcome. Why? Because it's a pilot project. We've got 2 significant players in Toronto giving a rip about this. It's small, but there are some system changes, some hedging here, little behavior changes. The impact happens to be quite modest. You'll see there's some utility savings and some GHG reductions, but here's the significance of this, and this is what people are asked to do. Toronto City Housing Corporation is the largest single owner of residential apartments in Toronto. Over 50% of its stock requires renewal. I made that number up, by the way. A successful pilot here could catalyze action not only within them, but with other apartment owners. So this is a really great bellwether organization. And when we looked at the contribution, here's just a sample. People thought both sharing the idea and sharing design ideas had a big contribution to that pilot project. So that was just a little change, but there was a contribution. When you actually zoom out and saying, well, what does that little change mean? Outcome harvesting says you should track that over time and start tracking different dates and different times. And you'll see this diagram here, which is from Improving Waste Management Systems in Southeast Europe. This is a World Bank case study. Each of these bubbles is one of those outcome vignettes. And let's consider this like a visual executive summary of a change initiative. And they've actually coded them by colors here. Green is operational improvements. The wavy line is policy improvements. The red line is political commitments. And they say, look how these little things accumulate over time. Each of those, again, is like a little outcome vignette. And if you wanted to create a report, you would say, here's the visual summary. And we've got 17 little stories that tell you about policy nudges or system nudges throughout time. Here's another one. Gives you a little example of improving administration to a regional health system. You can see pilot project is one of them. Number N is sort of a learning. Oh, the civil service wakes up and says, we really got some bad communication going. Number Q is the Vice Minister of Education agrees to new process. Again, it's not a policy, but there's a systems change, etc. I hope you see how this can work from these simple examples and imagine all the little vignettes you could track from your policy change efforts. Little ending piece here, the steps for policy change are, number 1, you design the harvest. What do you want to know? Number 2, review your documentation and draft outcome statements. So pretending you're Liz, meeting on a Friday afternoon for 15 minutes, she says, oh, I better write some of these up more fulsomely. She writes them out. Number 3, then you go engage with people who are involved in them. And you'd say, hey, here's an outcome statement. What do you think? You're 100% not going to get it right because they're going to say, you forgot this. What about that? And here's another outcome statement you didn't even think about. You develop them, you upgrade them, and then for high-level statements where you think, boy, we better not drink our own Kool-Aid. Let's talk to people who saw these outcomes happen but weren't necessarily part of our innovation team. And you can substantiate some of those with third parties if you want. Then you look for patterns, and then you use the data to communicate and use it for strategic learning and strategic choices. Here, by the way, is an outcome harvest of the Calgary initiative for Payday lending. I did this, and I did it in about 90 minutes after reading their documentation. And it's not as cool as the other one because this one looks quite linear, but it gives you a sense of all the blues, municipal policy change, purples, provincial, or browns, provincial policy change, purple, private sector changes, particularly around credit unions. And in the black, you can see things like impact. Edmonton Journal reports that the number of payday lending stores in the province drops to 165, and it used to be 235. Here are some of the methods for that. Level 2, outcome harvesting, and a very nice technique out of Australia called the significant instance of policy and systems change. Let's go to level 3, and then we're going to go into quick discussion in groups. Level 3 methods are where I'm not going to give you a specific method, but this is where you might look at level 1 and level 2 and you go, well, that's terrific, but I actually want to do a deeper dive on those bubbles. Some of those bubbles require us to do more thinking and analysis, and so I'm going to weave together whatever methods I need at the moment. And I'm going to say here, the answer to what methods you might use in level 3 depends entirely every single time on what your questions are and how much capacity you have. You could be using policymaker rating scales, ripple effect mapping, focus groups, do more systems mapping. There's goofy things called propensity score matching, case studies, etc. You'll see a bunch of them in the workbook, but again, I can't say anything about what you should use, but what this says is if you want to go deeper, you'll probably have to develop a customized design. Most of you will find level 2 does more than enough. Sometimes it won't. Those are 3 methods, folks. And again, the questions are about what kind of changes did we make to systems? Did we change a driver? Does it change anyone's behavior? And to what degree are we changing the overall behavior of the system? When you're asking those questions, you should always keep in your mind 12 principles that we talked about before, including weaving together a patchwork of data, and number 7, matching methods to capacity, and number 8, making informed choices about whether you want to adopt a method, adapt a method, or start from scratch. You'll also note that in each of these methods, all of them included number 9. We had some way of trying to estimate contribution in each of those questions with increasing levels of robustness as we go through the different levels from 1 to 3. That is the general idea, folks. This is a new topic, and for many of us, it's not entirely straightforward. So this tries to provide some coherence about how you go around doing that, and it does link you to some pretty good methods with lots of examples when you start Googling them about how those methods are applied. I'm going to actually turn it back over to Kirsty now, and I'll stop the. I'll just move the slides for you, Kirsty, but you can facilitate.
Perfect. Yeah, sounds great, Mark. Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Super. Okay. So everyone will have already received links to the workbook. Hopefully you've had a chance to look them over. If you have, you'll know that there are deep dive or short exercise options to work through depending on what your needs are as an individual or group working through the modules. And then, of course, your manager of cities will be connecting with you as well to debrief about this particular training. But I'm going to move on to closing announcements, unless, Mark, there's anything else you'd like to add?
Nope. I just that based on the questions that we hear from everyone, we will for sure send some additional resources that may not be in the workbook. But so, Kirsty, I know we can do that. There might be a couple extras coming your way.
Absolutely, for sure. Thanks, Mark. Thank you for your presentation. So in closing, I just want to remind you that the workbook is your homework between now and the next session. Today's recording and materials will be emailed to you very soon, and city managers will be checking in with you very shortly as well. Our next module 4 will be taking place on June 26th between 1 and 2 Eastern time. A couple of our other webinars are happening coming up in the next few weeks, so we want to let you know about them in case you're interested in joining. We'd love for you to. This one is taking place tomorrow, and I think Stephen, who's on the line with us, he's doing the series, will be interviewing Opportunity Central Iowa partners Steph and Helene about how in just 2 years they almost 25,000 Central Iowans became financially self-sufficient. They've done some amazing work in Iowa, particularly around engaging lived experience, really rallying the community behind a vision and strategy. So we want to talk to them about how did you get to that impact, how are you going to sustain that, and what are you going to do next? So it should be an exciting conversation, and we'd love for you to join. In addition, on June 12th, there's a webinar taking place on the financial empowerment ecosystem model with Charlene Chirado from Prosper Canada. In this, you'll learn how to identify and understand your financial empowerment ecosystem and how you and partners can uncover opportunities to help put money in the pockets of local residents. Thanks again for participating in today's training. If you have any questions or comments about today's webinar, please feel free to email one of your city managers. And now with the official training having come to a close, you're welcome to jump off the line now if you're not able to stay. However, if you would like to stay, please stay on. We'll just give it a minute for people to jump off, and then we can start our conversation. Alrighty. Hi, everybody. Thanks for staying on. Sorry we had to skip through the large group debrief, but I thought this is a great opportunity to maybe float some of those questions that had come up for you in your small groups. And we've got Mark here who's able and willing to respond. And we'd love to basically see who has questions and get through as many as we can in the next 30 minutes. So with that, there's no formal plan of how we'd like to do this other than let us know if you have a question, and we'd love to hear it. Anyone want to go first?
Hello.
Hi there.
Hi, Leo here from City of Windsor.
Hi, Stephen and Leo, right?
Yeah. So I was trying to formulate this question actually in the small breakout groups, so bear with me a little bit. But one of the things that we've been finding is that we are in a situation where we can use some of these frameworks, which we're very excited about, in two different settings. One in kind of like an internal departmental setting to see what kind of efficiencies we can find, but also what kind of essentially the connective tissue that we have across some of our departments that may be focusing on very similar topics related to poverty reduction. And then the other one is kind of more in that larger population size approach, right? Where we may want to see, you know, how change is occurring from a citywide level. Now, from the internal perspective, though, I was just wondering if there was a particular framework or kind of you know, evaluation style that would be more appropriate within that internal approach as opposed to in that larger kind of population-based approach.
Mm-hmm. And when you say internal, can you describe the institution in which you have all these internal actors?
So
is it the city?
Yeah, so this is within the City of Windsor.
Yeah.
So for instance, we have some great opportunities to be connecting more and more with our, for example, our children's services and housing departments to kind of make more of a joint effort towards understanding and really measuring impact in regards to poverty reduction. But a big piece of that is we want to make sure that everybody is on board, and in some cases, having a framework prior to getting to the point where everyone is together is almost like doing a little pilot study type thing.
Yeah.
Really
Yes.
with the possibility of moving it forward at a larger citywide level, right? Yeah. So just kind of wanting to see if there's any suggestions for that.
Well, I like the way you're framing that. You use some words that I find helpful. One is, you know, this idea of experimenting and playing a bit before you bet big. And we just had an evaluating systems change workshop in Ottawa, and the second to last module was about prototyping evaluation practices. And the idea was, don't bet big, bet small. Try little things, see if they're useful, and if they are, expand. If they're not, shut it down. And so how do you do it in a way that engages people so they see value in it? So I like that stance that you're suggesting. Second is, you know, I'm trying to think about what it would be like to work in a city, knowing that it is somewhat hierarchical at times, because and so people are kind of more vertically driven than horizontally driven, if that makes sense. I'm not making specific observations about Windsor, I'm just saying in general. And so how would you do something that started light and was engaging, that built up the appetite for doing something a bit more complex if it was needed? And one of the things I thought about, because there's a similar project in Edmonton that I'm using about similar dynamics, is a thing called, I think it's called collaborative or community outcomes reporting. And we can send a link to this after. It's developed by the same person, Jess Starch, who did most significant change and significant instances of policy and systems change we talked about in the webinar. But what it is like a real participatory thing that I think you could do in a couple hours. Let's say over a long brown bag lunch, for instance, where you said, hey, what are all the changes related to this thing? You know, changing policies for specific neighborhood or social procurement or something, whatever your it is, that allowed a lot of people to contribute their little pieces of the policy change agenda, where you allowed yourself to see a pattern. And then you would say, have a discussion about, so what now? How do we become more than the sum of our parts? So I don't think it's heavy, because outcome harvesting, I love outcome harvesting, but outcome harvesting is something that requires a bit more effort that people might be open to if they like the experience of this community outcomes or collaborative outcomes reporting. So a staged thing is really, I like it, and something that's participatory and easy to begin with at the start, because I know your work in the city, you've got so many processes and practices you have to manage. You shouldn't introduce new ones lightly. I don't know if that's helpful.
That's very helpful. Sorry, I was looking for the unmute button. No, thank you very much. That's great.
You know what I'll do when we do the follow-up, Kirsty, I'm going to send you this, whatever it is, I'll find out, community or collaborative outcomes reporting. And I'll also send you a 2-pager on prototyping evaluation practices before you go big.
Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks for your question, Stephen and Leo. Next person, anyone else have a question? Feel free to introduce yourself if you got a question, or comments, or feedback, or reflections, I should add. And please do remember to unmute yourself if you are on mute.
I have a question for the group if there are none, Kirsty.
Go ahead, Mark.
So I'm always interested in this, that part of when we do evaluation, we should be largely user responsive. So saying, well, what do people want to know? And pay attention to that audience. So it's very much a responsive oriented exercise evaluation. But there are times if you are stewarding a change effort, evaluation can help also with the agenda of improving civic literacy. And you know, I'm like you, probably involved or interested in lots of complex issues. I think one of the biggest challenges of our times is people's civic literacy on things is really low. And so as we get into populist politics, I think it's in some ways dangerous because people actually don't know what they're talking about. They don't understand it. They really, really don't understand it, but yet they have extraordinarily powerful opinions that are, you know, not wrong, they're just not right. And so the idea of saying, you know what, almost everyone wants a programmatic story, or someone wants some kind of bottom line indicator, which will be module 5. But to what degree can we capture and make sense and communicate changes in policy in a way that improves civic literacy amongst our constituency and stakeholder? So treat it as also not just a communication, but an education exercise or an engagement exercise. The reason I like that is when I looked at the payday lending example of Calgary, I thought, boy, oh boy, you cannot help but understand the dynamics of payday lending and complexity more after hearing that story, right? You're smarter from hearing the story. It's not just the outcomes, it's the narrative, it's the story. So let me throw that out to the group. Who kind of feels like it might be a little bit of an extra work, but this is also beyond simply communicating progress. This is an engagement education mechanism as well.
Hi, it's Elaine and Julie. I think there's actually huge benefits to that, because we know from some of our working groups,
yeah,
there are people who have opinions that they launch everywhere that are not based on truth or fact.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so sort of bringing them into our fold, as much as we'd not like to, is actually educating them and giving them the right information to be able to support initiatives and support what's happening, as opposed to criticize everybody for doing nothing.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I'll just share that.
Well, you know, that's, let me give you an example of me maybe not being the kind of person who's just belting out opinions without facts, but I think we all do it. Here's something I learned in that payday lending, that one of the reasons that people go to payday lending, because you think about it on the surface, it looks kind of irrational, right? Why would you pay those rates, etc., is that if you go to a bank, it takes a long time to get money, and people often feel judged for taking money out or doing with the money what they want to do, and they actually get a lot of, often from tellers or bank managers, remedial kind of suggestions. And so there's the context of going to a bank is so awkward that they quite naturally, spontaneously go to payday lenders. And so part of the education is, well, why the hell are people going to payday lenders in the first place? This is what you learn when you try and tell the larger story about what it takes to reduce it. Because if we don't create alternatives for payday lending, people are just going to find their way back to another version of payday lending. Right? It's entirely natural that people do it. So that's the education thing. I read that and I go, oh my gosh, I'm a little bit smarter than I was, you know, an hour and a half ago on this topic. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely agree with that education piece as being essentially part of the results, part of the outcomes. Prior to me being at the city, I was doing community work at the grassroots level, and I'll be very brief, but essentially we were trying to improve civic, I guess, understanding of the budget process with the city of Windsor. So we were able to kind of connect with different departments and connect with different counselors to kind of help educate that process. It's something that we want to continue with here in our social policy and planning department, with kind of having a better understanding when it comes down to social investment and poverty reduction in general. Because I think in many cases, some people will take poverty alleviation and poverty reduction or poverty of opportunities as being synonymous when they're vastly different. And kind of how you approach and tackle some of those challenges needs to be more refined based off of the element that you're actually trying to approach. So I think having that education piece included and baked into even our request for proposal process, and how our service providers will eventually do evaluation is really important to have that consistency in evaluation, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, boy, guys, I'm enjoying this because I haven't even thought about some of this. But what if the communication of this is, let's say it's payday lending. Let's just pretend that's our collective thing. The payday lending story is, hey, everyone, meet Jonathan or Laura or whoever. Here is what they're doing. Case study, payday lending. Zoom in, really zoom in. And here's what happens. Here's what they're doing, and here's why they're doing it. Because if you go to banks or it's not efficient, whatever it is, let people understand it. Then you zoom out and say, here's the problem of the larger system to which Jonathan or Laura's story is embedded. Blah, 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 whatever they are. And here's the things that we did at a systemic level to reduce the chances that there's 1,000 more Jonathans, Laura's, whatever. Talk about the outcomes at the big level, and then zoom in again and saying, hey, we talked about this in the first session, by the way. Now back to Jonathan or Laura, here's how their lives are different. What you're doing there is talking about a system change, talking about an impact, but also doing it in a way that describes what you've contributed to that and engrazes the civic understanding or literacy of the issue that we need to address to reduce poverty. I got excited. I'm writing this down. I think that'd be a great thing to do. And the test would be, could we do it for any of your issues?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense.
So Jill, just give an example of one of the things you're working on in Windsor that where there's a systemic issue that directly affects people on the ground.
I'm trying to think. So I guess to say for in one example, we have a neighborhood engagement kind of strategy. It's not quite that type of terminology, but we have a group called the Community Partnership, and with that, they are supporting individuals. Essentially, they're a service provider that we're funding that is located in different social housing neighborhoods, but also in neighborhoods that have had high prevalence of low income and in many cases high prevalence of crime rates. Where we've been looking at trying to support them on now, as we're looking at it from an evaluation standpoint, is really to kind of see how they're improving the individuals who they're serving. They're improving their lives of the individuals that they're serving. Because in many respects, from an anecdotal perspective, we can go in, we can have conversations with the coordinators, have conversations with the clients, and we know that it's great. People love it. People love the programming. They love being able to interact with people, to other neighbors, because there's a high range of social isolation based in those neighborhoods. And this is a way to connect. But from an evaluation standpoint, and even from a standpoint of letting the rest of the city understand that this is almost a best practice, it's been difficult for them to wrap their heads around how do you evaluate this type of a thing. I don't know if I'm getting off topic here, but I think where it ends up being helpful is we can see it from how I think what the type of evaluation that we're trying to do now is help them on the ground level with figuring out how they can evaluate it, and then how figure out kind of moving one layer up to see how we as a city might be able to provide them with different connectors. So for example, we also fund a service that is creates community gardens across the county and across Windsor. It's one aspect of what they do. And this CUP location may want to create, a community garden, but they may have a problem with access to water. That's where the city, we can come in and say, hey, we actually have a Parks and Rec department that drives around in a big water truck, and we can kind of give you that contact information and connect you to, so that this Access Community Gardens place can build a garden. You can have the garden, and we can also have the connection to have that water, and we can evaluate then that level, the higher level of the interaction, right? How each three component parts are working in unison, right? So I think, and I don't know if I really hit the way you were saying, but essentially that's kind of trying to figure out the evaluative framework that can do that through line from ground level to kind of those that collaboration across the board, and then hopefully at the larger scale from a population approach.
And it really reinforces their study of the community gardens and the water truck. The water truck ship may or may not be a policy change, but it is a behavior change, right? So whatever driver you use, it might have just been more information or more coordination. You could say it's a million little things like this that make a difference. Yeah, that's great. Any other questions on methods or about systems thinking in general? Again, we tried to make it tight, a complex topic tight, but it's very easy to go into some of the stuff in depth or even broader. There's so many nice new innovations going on right now in this field that once you open it up, it's almost endless. I'll throw another thing out. I don't know if we put it on the workbook. Maybe Kirsty or Elle, you could check in real time. I've forgotten. I think we put it in there. Sometimes people don't like things this abstract because they want it to be even more granular, and we tried to make that granular with some case studies. The problem is when you start to getting really detailed, it becomes really specific to unique contexts. And then other people start going, well, that's not my context, and this is too granular and I don't like it. So we're trying to find the right balance between giving you general ideas and very detailed responses. So most of our methods are process methods. They're kind of content agnostic. They don't worry about different kinds of systems change. But there are lots of frameworks being developed for specific kinds of systems change efforts. And there's lots on policy change, for example. I think that's in there. There's 10 different ways of changing policy, and they each have evaluation implications. But one of them that's in there is about improving human service systems. And that's an extraordinarily detailed human systems change framework. But for anyone who's involved in human systems change, that might be a real good one to look at, knowing that you're always going to adapt it because it's so specific, it's hard to adopt. But for any of those who want more in-depth information, take a look at that one.
Noting that, Mark. It looks like we still have 9 minutes. The other opportunity here too is if you have questions for each other, it doesn't necessarily have to be for Mark.
Right.
If you have questions for each other, we'd love to hear what those are as well. This is an opportunity to discuss and dialogue too.
Kirsty, maybe in absence of that, I can maybe just touch on something that came up in my group, just because I know it did. And this was about outcome harvesting and how to do it. And what we'll do is a follow-up. I'm going to send out a book review of the book for outcome harvesting, as well as one group's adaptation of that general approach into a guide. And there's lots of resources on this, so you won't have any shortage of this. But the key thing is, on like any of these techniques, is to try them first and not pretend you're going to get great at them right up front. This is a long-term game of using methods and getting good at them. So if you're frustrated it doesn't work the first time, that's more of an expectation problem than anything else. So take a look at, if you want to do a real shallow thing, I'll send you this guide from Future Cities Canada where they adopted and adapted a little bit outcome harvesting. And I'm going to give you a book review of the book itself. And I've said it in the book review, but it is the best methods book I've read in the last 5 years. It is so good. And for someone who's serious about it, if you like the short version, consider buying it, $32 or something like that. Maybe it's a little bit more. It really is an excellent guide, step by step, chapter by chapter, that goes into detail. You may not like all the detail, but you're sure going to get a lot of good tips.
Yeah, we'll make sure we put that in our follow-up, Mark.
Great.
Super. Well, I'll give it another 30 seconds if anyone has a question, but we may close early. Okay, I think that's our answer. Okay, thanks everybody for staying on, and thank you, Mark, for answering questions. And this was sort of an experiment to see how would the 30 minutes work. And yeah, we'll figure out if you want to do this again next time. Let us know in the feedback as managers of cities if you think we should do this again.
Super. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.